It's some real Star Trek shit. Hello, and everybody, and welcome to What is Comics, the official Indie Comics Creator Con podcast. I am your host, Jamie Jones, and I'm with Matt Sardo, and we're going to talk about what comics is. That's what we're going to do. But before we get into our conversation with Ro Higashi, a great cartoonist, comes from the web, goes into indie comics, making all the things. Let's talk about a little bit of Indie Comics Creator Con before we get into that interview.
Indie Comics Creator Con in New Haven, Connecticut, at Southern Connecticut State University. Lots of free parking. Like that's the bullet points right there that I forgot last week. But this week I did another head count. I think we're at 179 creators coming to the show. Jim Rugg, Tom Scioli, Dean Haspel, the headliners. There's gift bags for the first 100 attendees, and I've been getting swag almost every day from indie creators put in the bags. So these are going to be the hottest items of the show. So go to indiecomicscreatorcon.com for all the details. Get your tickets. They're only $8.
We will have portfolio reviews at the show with editor-in-chief of Mad Cave, Mike Marks, and senior editor Heather Antos of IDW. That's a cool thing. Get your portfolios checked out. And since we are taking over the entire third floor of the cultural center, what is it? The student center, whatever it is, there is going to be a big scavenger hunt with an original art grand prize that will be drawn Friday night, the night before the show. We have a big drink and draw event, and it's going to be a good time.
You brought up a good point. You brought up a solid point. There is a drink and draw event at the hotel on Friday, and then there's an after party at the hotel on Saturday after the show. It's after the show. It's the after party. But go to indiecomicscreatorcon.com. That has the link to the hotel. Come stay with us. I think we've got like 50, 60 rooms already booked. So we're taking over that hotel. So the show itself is a ton of fun, but the before and after, a little crazy. You got to come with us.
Enjoy the ride. Should we talk about our sponsors for the show before we get into this interview? We have Comics Wellspring for all your comics printing needs. We have Cosmic Lion Productions, the production company to the stars. Dark Horse Comics has provided so many things to go in those grab bags. Monkeys Fighting Robots, and New Haven's alternate universe, the only comic shop in New Haven. They're
That's
here.
so weird.
They have
It's
to be
so
at the
weird.
show.
It's crazy. But that comic shop is bonkers good. And I've spent way too much money there. We have some new sponsors. We have TD Art,
Ooh.
the Tulio Art Collective, and Athenium Comic Art. These are all art reps, and we're gonna elevate the game of the indie scene here, people. But we have to talk to Ro, don't we?
We do. Before we do that, though, Matt, let's since we are now part of the Comic Art Fans family, check out their YouTube channel, Comic Art Live. Now let's talk to Ro. So you came from webcomics and internet culture, webcomic stuff, and now you're doing print. What has that transition? You had good readership on Webtoons, and like I'm looking at numbers and I'm like, oh man, this is good stuff. How has the transition been?
What's interesting is that those subscriber numbers and then follower counts on Instagram and everything, and then people who have followed me for so long, more than half of them admitted that they actually never read my webcomic until I put it in print. Because a lot of them, just didn't like the webcomic format. And that makes sense. I'm really dyslexic. And so for me, like doing the webcomic format was easier on my mind because I only had to think about panel per panel rather than like, does this panel and how does it flow, with the rest of the page. So formatting that was a little crazy. Then when I did that, I had my first run, I think, the first print run, I modeled it after a lot of other like scroll up web comics that were formatted to print. And I'm realizing that the people who formatted those for print probably were not comic people. Mm-hmm. And so me modeling it after that was probably not a good idea. So the Redux that you saw for volume 1, which is going to be like the same page count, but like a newer version, is going to have more of a traditional comic feel. So
yeah, this is the Cosmic Lion Productions has been publishing your stuff. Did they do the first iteration?
we did the first print run. Yeah, I actually wanted to self-publish for a while. I'm really close with my kids and my husband. They're lovely people. We spend a little too much time together. And there was a pushback from them for me to put them in print. I think they didn't understand like the print industry, and they were worried that if I had self-published, that then I would be stuck with like 500 copies of these books that weren't selling. And I think also too, my kids were not reading like comic books that were in English at that time, so they were just not interested in it. So I think I let that influence me a little too much, and so like I was really depressed about it because my two good friends were like pressuring me. No, you need to put it in print. Like you're gonna see, like you're gonna like reach in a whole new readership. And they ended up being right. Like I said, like more than half of my followers admitted that they didn't read it when it was just a webcomic, and then after it was in print, they were just like, "Oh, I didn't realize, the story was so good. I love your characters and everything. I'm so glad you put it in print." And I was just like, "Oh, okay." I didn't mind, if people follow me but they don't read my comic, because I didn't exactly test people and be like, "Hey, do you know who the character is or whatever?" But I should probably do a little bit more of that for research purposes. But at the same time, I don't know how.
What was your release schedule when you were doing it digitally?
So the release schedule in 2024, I did take a huge break. If you see, I only updated the webcomic probably like 3 or 4 times in 2024. Yeah. But before, it used to be like every 2 to 3 weeks that I'd put something up. And my goal was to have something, panel count. So I try to reach a certain panel count. So if you work for a Webtoon original, for example, they usually want you to do at least a 50 to a 100 panel count. And that is every week. And the only way that people can make that work is if you have your inker, your colorist, your background artist, and the main artist / creator does all the penciling. But I think they only get paid around like $2,000 a month, and then the money, they are the ones that pay those assistants, not right. Webtoon. So in the end, like they bring very little back, like by themselves. And then I heard some of the contracts were pretty predatory. So for example, if you are like a Webtoon original artist, I heard that like they own your entire IP. So if you decide that you don't want to draw your comic anymore, and you want to break your contract, like, okay, but you can't ever draw those characters ever again, or that story ever again. You can't repurpose it for anything else because they own your work essentially. And so that was a little scary for me, which is why I was looking into self-publishing. And then conveniently, Eli approaches me and he's like, "Hey, I'm going to start like a publishing business, and I kind of want you to be one of the first ones that's on there." And it was good timing for me because it was just like maybe 4 or 5 months right after I had that really difficult conversation with the kids and Shinobu, because I don't have, like, I'm a one-woman studio. I don't have like an inker and a colorist and all of that. And if I'm at shows, like when I say that I used to be print guy, like I had a massive amount of merchandise, like over 250 different items, like different designs and stuff. So bringing 10, 15 each of those, it was a lot. And so I think for the kids in Shinobu, they felt obligated to help me, but I'd say they only went with me maybe like 1 out of every 7 shows. And when they did go with me, like it was so cumbersome for them that they would get kind of overwhelmed. And so the thought of then adding like these books, that's why they were just like, "We don't want you to do the books." Yeah. And so when Eli approached me, I was like, "Oh, okay, so he'll just do it." Yeah. And then I could just focus on creating. So he basically, what he usually does is he gives me like a hard deadline, and we check in like maybe once a week, and he checks on my progress. And I think for volume 2, I actually needed like a week extension for that one, but it ended up being like he was giving other creators like 2 or 3 week extensions. So I thought I was a week late, but I ended up being 2 weeks early. So I think he was good about, I think some people are going to need extra time. So he gave us like an earlier date on purpose without telling us. Yeah.
Yeah. Padding the release schedule is always a good thing.
Yeah.
I have a hard deadline for Friday. That is not the actual deadline. It's difficult when you're the one person like
that you know all the secrets.
But I have to like psych myself out. I'm like, I'm not working. It's got to be done on Friday. But
my hard deadline for the program is this Friday. Like the IC3 program has to get the printer this Friday.
That's wild because you told me last Friday.
Yeah, and you got me your page
yesterday.
Yeah.
As long as it makes it before the print date, right?
Yep.
Can you take it back a few steps and talk about how Eli approached you and how that kind of all came together?
So I have a really, really good friend. We've been close for over a decade. His name is David Grom, and he was one of the artists, I think, in the Grand Design. And he told me, during the pandemic, hey, there's me and these other indie comic artists. We're going to be working on this thing. And I think I did some ink work for Ben Granoff. I say ink work, but Ben sometimes would draw like a little circle and then like maybe one or two defining characteristics. And I'd be like, who is this? And David was really good about, I think that is this villain. And then I'd have to basically pencil it in while trying to make it look like his art as much as possible. So there was a lot of that. I say that, but I still learned a lot from, the way that he was kind of laying out everything. I think Ben is one of those geniuses with that kind of stuff. He's really great at storytelling. And so it was a very humbling experience for me. And it was just kind of me freaking out because I'm like, I don't know these guys. And my first work is going to be this. Like, I need to make sure it's legit. So I was putting a lot of pressure on myself at the time. And then slowly I got to know some of the other creators. So nowadays, me, Rick Lopez, and David Grom will be drawing almost every night on Zoom together, just working on our own things and then just kind of updating each other and keeping each other motivated. So awesome. Through them, then that's where I met Eli, and that's where he started to do his Cosmic Lion podcast. And then, when he started the publishing, then he reached out to me on Facebook. So
were you working on your comic as like Half of the Crown coming out while this is all happening, so okay.
I think at that time, so right now Half of the Crown has about like 32 chapters out, I think, and then at that time I was working on like chapter 8 or 9, so it was a while ago. And then I forgot to mention this too, like I would do a lot of what I was doing with Ben Granoff, where I was inking his stuff. I was also inking other people's work and then also lettering other people's stuff too. And so it was my way of just kind of learning that stuff. If I feel like that I could kind of get almost like an internship, but at the same time recognition for it, I feel like it's two birds with one stone. And I definitely was very lucky in the projects where I was an inker and a letterer. Like I feel like those were with phenomenal pencilers and other artists. And so it was just, I learned a lot for that, and I took a lot home for my own comic. So, yeah.
That's crazy because I was reading through Volume 1 and Volume 2 of the book. Last night I read Volume 1. Today I read Volume 2, and there is a
huge jump,
giant leap. Once you hit page like 55 in Volume 2, I'm like, oh, this is like a very different artist. But like coloring techniques and stuff gradually change, but then you have there's a real hard change, and I was wondering where that comes from, why that happens.
So I think I was originally just a traditional comic artist, and so when I went into digital, it was a really hard transition for me because I felt like I had to chase this very digital looking thing. And I moved away from what my traditional looked like. And then I realized like I was so unhappy doing that. And I realized I made it try to look like too much like all the other really clean, really neat looking web comics that were out at the time. And Rick and David were actually really great about like, hey, dude, we found your prototype when you did this comic before, like an earlier version, because there was like 8 other versions of this comic before I settled on this version. And a past version, I think Jerome Cabanatan and Rick had stumbled upon it on the internet. And they kind of had an intervention with me and just like, what the fuck is this? Why does this look so different than what you're doing now? And how come you're not making it look like this? Because it was very, very gritty. Like I think I had like one of the villains had summoned the bones of an orca whale to like attack people. And so it was just very, you know, punk and lots of ink, lots of toning. And so they're just like, what happened to this? And I just realized like, oh, I guess I was trying to reinvent myself into something that I wasn't very happy with. And so over time, I just allowed myself to kind of feel a little bit more vulnerable. And as that went on too, I was taking like an internship inking this one Korean artist pencils. And she thought that I was going to make it very clean looking, but I loved her sketchy lines so much that I ended up just inking her sketchy lines. And she's like, that's not what I expected, but it looks great. And I took that back with me because that's what I used to do when I did it traditionally. So I think as long as I keep chasing that traditional foot or feel and that kind of grit, I think it will continue to look as it does right now. But that's kind of what happened at that time. That's why there was a huge transition. It was more of like a return of how I used to make my art look.
Yeah, there's a big thing that I notice when I look at people's art from their published work, and then I look at their sketchbook, and it's every single time I go, oh, the sketchbook's so much better.
So much better, yeah.
And it's congratulations on discovering that, and then also congratulations on allowing yourself to do it in the book you're currently working on, right? Like, yeah. I was wondering while I was reading it, because I could see subtle differences and subtle changes for almost, you know, every 10 pages, which makes sense because that'd be about like what, once a month, right? You get a different little thing. And there's subtle things, subtle changes that I was wondering, are you holding yourself back at certain points to make it look like the original stuff?
Yes, which is terrible. I'm trying to make sure that it's a gradual change, that it's not super upsetting. The story I've had laid out for a really long time, so it's not like I decided a different direction for the story, so it's more gritty. I had planned for it to be this, and I was actually quite nervous to get to the scene where they start fighting like the aswangs. And the second, aswang is like a word for Filipino cryptids, because my whole comic is basically supposed to be like an anime / more supernatural version of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Instead of vampires, they fight cryptids, right? Filipino cryptids, I mean. And so I had planned for these scenes to come up, and I was very worried, like working up to the scenes, like, gosh, would I be able to pull this off? Because I've moved away from kind of that horror look for so long. Like, can I tap back into that? Like, I just wasn't sure. And then I think too, you know, having the kids, and then also at the time, like my husband was on a lot of live streams that were like E3 live streams and stuff, because he was working for Nintendo. And so there was almost this pressure to like, oh gosh, I got to make sure that it looks appropriate, that it's like, you know, appropriate for the kids. And now I realize, like, you know, I understand why I did that, but that was also a mistake, because I think it was too much outside influences that like I didn't necessarily need to let influence what I was doing at the time, but I definitely did. So
yeah, because page 92 of the second book, where the cryptid and the eyeballs, there's like that panel on the bottom right hand corner where you finally see it, and I'm like, whoa, that's like, I don't know, it's, you know, because you have everything, which is kind of, I call it, you know, it's kind of very anime cartoonish, and then you get to that and I'm like, oh, that's the late night anime cartoon.
Yeah.
It changes so dramatically, and it's such a cool, like, it's such a cool moment. Reading it from the creator's perspective, you're like, yeah, she's going. This is where it is. This is the thing.
So other than manga, I grew up with a lot of indie horror Filipino comics. And those are so easy to get, and they were drawn so horrifically. And as a kid, a lot of people grow up with like Freddy Krueger and Friday the 13th and stuff like that. I'm dating myself, but back then, like all my dad had were like bootlegs of Aswang movies, and they were always so gruesome and brutal and scary. And as a kid, like I would be so terrified of them, but at the same time, it was like a train wreck. Like it's terrible, but you can't look away. You gotta you gotta slow down and see what's going on. And the Aswang comics were not any different. And I think too, around that time in the 90s and 2000s, the Philippines was going through a huge like horror content creation sort of thing in the comics scene. And I remember distinctly, like I think I was like 9 or 10, and I was reading this one comic, and I grew up Catholic, and this guy had this dream that when they were doing like communion, it was like the blood of the devil, and it was like this, instead of like bread, it was like this flesh that they like forced down his throat. And then he woke up thinking like, oh goodness, thank God it's just a dream. But then he goes to church, and then they do the same thing to him, and I was like, dang. So all of these would be drawn really, with a lot of grit, blood, like all of that. And I think that was, I think it's also too, like today's youth kind of grow up with a different kind of horror. And when I had that horror as a kid, now I'm looking back on it for like, oh, there's like a cultural aspect of it. Cause like the Philippines doesn't have a lot of preserved, like they didn't preserve a lot of their written history, because every time they got colonized by China or like Spain, they would just go ahead and destroy everything. So the only thing that they mostly have is like a lot of retold folklore from like generation to generation. And so that's what I really liked about the Aswang culture, is just like, okay, so that kind of tells us about, the people who created this, what they were feeling at the time. And so it was kind of those things that I wanted to preserve. But also, too, the reason why I wanted to be a little Buffy the Vampire Slayer-ish is because I think youth nowadays are dealing with a different kind of trouble. And I kind of wanted a comic that kind of represented that trouble, but kind of gave them a little bit of, yeah, this is hard, but also we'll just deal with this one step at a time. And that's kind of my goal for the characters, is that they kind of figure out how to deal with stuff, like kind of roll with the punches. And it's not supposed to romanticize, trauma or bad things that happen, but it's more of a, hey, we know this happens, and kind of want to hope that it kind of gives kids a different perspective of how they can handle things. I hope that makes sense without giving too much away.
So in the ending of book 1, you have your process. You say, I know what the ending is. I've written the whole thing. What has been your writing process for this thing? Is it airtight? Do you know exactly what's going to happen?
Ooh, not airtight.
Or I know what the last thing is.
Yeah, the only thing that is for sure is the last thing. I think I remember watching like a TED Talk or something like that about Pixar and how they write a lot of their movies. And this was like 15 years ago that I saw this, but they said something along the lines of, you write the ending first and then you work backwards. And I think that's why the past reiterations of this comic didn't work, is because I wasn't doing that. I think everyone had a similar ending to what I have now, but I think I needed to have a little bit more, I guess, confidence, or be a little bit more brave in portraying the ending. I think the ending back then I saw was kind of controversial / like, oh, this might make people feel some sort of way. But now I'm just feeling like, no, that's just how it's going to be. And it will be an experience for readers. I think now that I'm like looking at it that way, it's a little bit easier for me to like work backwards and stuff. And I was very lucky to have a longtime writer friend of mine. He writes for the series The Thief of Eyes, and Choir Files, I think, is what the collection of all of his short stories is called, within the same universe. And he writes a lot of horror type of dark fantasy things, and he's excellent at plot pointing. So at the beginning, he was very encouraging of like, hey, this part doesn't work here because this happens later. So I had a lot of guidance from him. His name is Michael McCaskill, which is interesting. We've been friends online for more than 30 years, but I met him in person for the first time when I moved to Texas, because I'm in Austin and he lives in San Antonio. So we've met up a few times, like in person finally. But yeah, so there was that too. I was fortunate to have that help, and I was working with his comic at the time too. So it's definitely something that I wish I can say that like I did it all on my own, but I think that's something I'm learning how to do now, right after I have the second book. Now I've kind of been branching out a little bit. I say that, but at the same time, I have my oldest daughter like proofread my stuff. so she's really great at pattern recognition. Like she got evaluated for it at both age 9 and age 11, and they said that she has superior intellect for pattern recognition. And so because of that, if I'm too redundant in a lot of my script writing, she'll just go in and be like, Mom, you don't need this spot. And I'll be like, oh, right, listen. So, I pay her an allowance. It's fine.
There you go. Do you write full scripts for everything, or
yeah, so I try to be a few scripts ahead for each one that I release online. Yeah.
What do those look like? Are you writing like plot or panel descriptions, dialogue, panel descriptions?
I write it like a movie script,
okay,
actually. And it kind of gives me a little less restriction on like, this needs to look like this and that panel. Because depending on how I feel that day, a lot of the times I just won't follow it. Like even if I imagine it as I'm writing it, as the panels flow, I'll realize, wait, that doesn't work. And so I'll have to rework it anyway. So just to kind of save time, I just keep it like a movie script and kind of leave the flow up to whatever I'm doing at the time.
And you mentioned that there's a couple different versions and that your friends have found old versions of it. So how many different versions of this story are out there, or have you?
There's only one that's kind of lingering out there, and I think it's like on Tapas. And the only reason it's there is because I lost access to that account, so it's just kind of forever in limbo until they decide to delete it because of inactivity. But for some reason they haven't yet, and that was the only reason why like Jerome Cabanatan ended up finding it. Yeah, Are you guys interested in seeing it right now? I guess. Gosh,
I was just wondering because I wasn't sure if there was like, this was version 4 of this story, where you've. Like,
oh, this one was probably version 5 or 6.
Wow.
Yeah, and the characters are mostly the same, and it was meant to be for like a Japanese audience because I had studied in Japan at like a legit manga school, one of the chains there. And I would go there after work and take night classes twice a week. And it was very, very intensive. And I only took a semester of that because we had to suddenly move back to the States. But I had originally had these characters, like all Japanese characters. And I was working on like, okay, I'm going to release this in Japan. And that was a bad idea. Because I think I had it in my head that we were going to move back someday. But since, that's not the case, I realized, okay, I need to make this more authentic to like my experience now. And so that's why it is what it is today. But let me see.
Has each one had like a major shift, right? Like bringing it from Japan to the Philippines seems like that's a major shift, enough of a major shift for it's a thing. Is that each iteration, are you finding something that's big enough to really change everything, or is it just like small things, little tweaks here and there?
So back in 2008, drawing manga was not, especially if it looked like legit manga and it didn't have like a lot of American influence on it, you got dragged in a lot of like comic forums. They were just like, they would say things like, "Yo, you're such a fucking poser. Like you're unoriginal," and all these things. And it just wasn't a safe place for manga artists back then. But obviously now it's a different time. But that's one of the reasons why I didn't feel comfortable releasing it in the States. at the time. But now, you know, since people are a lot more accepting, it's changed. But yeah, I sent the link to it in the chat. If you guys
I
want to take
just
a quick
kind of
look.
like, and I'm still trying to like grasp my head around, because like you released this as a webtoon, so like that's the scrolling format, right? I'm gonna dumb this down for
Yeah.
myself. So, but then what you sent me was kind of more of a like a manga style.
Yeah, I did it on traditional like manga paper, pen and
Right.
ink, like all of that. So, and it was supposed to be read like Japanese style because again, like it was my plan to like release this in Japan. And it sucks because I am definitely not a translator. So a lot of the English in this past version sounded really strange because I was thinking in Japanese as I was writing it. And that doesn't work very well. That's not what people should do.
And so then like you go from webtoons and you go to print, and how did go through the process of like pulling the panels and laying them out and putting them on page and like all that stuff, making it,
I
making it
had to
work.
make sure that I was not married to a lot of my work, but at the same time, like correcting things so they looked a little bit more uniform. So for example, I had one character that has a very Owen Wilson looking nose, and there was so many panels I forgot to draw that, you know, detail in, and I was like, oh crap. So I had to like go back in and you know, correct it. And there's a lot of things like that. But because, you know, when you make something for scroll format, it's very vertical. And so there was a lot of scenes where I had to cut off like, you know, someone's body, and it would just be like a floating head. And I'm like, oh, that's not what I intended. But trying to make it fit, you know, so it wouldn't be the same boring layout of just these vertical panels. It was pretty hard, and I had to cut off and abandon a lot of art. And I also had to reconstruct a lot of art too, to again make it look like and mimic the style that I had before. And then I think, for example, there was this one panel where when it's scroll up format for just kind of tension purposes, you only saw like half of their face when they were having like a realization of something. But the only space that I could find to put them in was kind of a very horizontal space. So then I had to reconstruct like the other half of her face to put in the comic, but make sure it looks like the style that it was before. So there was a lot of that. That ended up being way more of a headache than I realized, to the point that I think from now on, I'm probably going to have to construct it in like originally in this for print format, and then kind of go backwards and put it in scroll format. And I feel like that would be a little bit better, and a lot for time purposes be easier.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, because there's a page I think in the first volume where Penny, or it could be the second one, where Penny's turned into a ghost, and she's like jumping up to the second floor of the gymnasium. And I'm just in my head, I'm like, okay, you have the panels on the left side where you're scrolling down, but then she like jumps up and it's this long panel. I'm like, how do you experience that when you're like scrolling? Because you're starting from the top to the bottom, and like,
yeah,
it's and then putting it together. I'm just, because I really enjoy, and I try to make artists understand this more and more, and they're like, whatever. But like when I'm flipping a page and going through and like how stuff carries my eye and moves things around, like I really like go crazy about that stuff, because like when it's done well, like it's so much fun to actually read a book, like move with it and stuff. And
I am in very, very strict belief that a page needs to look like a Monet painting, where your eye is kind of taken from, you know, different places. Like if it turns out that your eye has to go like this and then, you know, like that, I don't think that's good storytelling. I think it's kind of jarring. Like I think if you have to be like, wait, did I read that correctly? And then read it back like 3 or 4 times, it just kind of disrupts the flow of the storytelling. And I did my best with formatting it, and I think I did okay for the most part with what I had. But I think to prevent any of those problems from popping up again, I'm just going to have to just do it in this format first from now on. Is the conclusion I came to.
Volume 1, Volume 2, those were all done digital first or webtoon first?
Digital scroll up format, and then I had to format it for these. Yeah.
Cool.
And how many chapters are the 2 books?
So I think The end of volume 2 goes to chapter 29, I think, or 28.
Okay.
I forget. So there's 4 other chapters that are not, in print format yet, that are out. But yeah, I need to speed that up.
And how many? Do you know how many chapters total it's going to be, or?
I wish I knew. Unfortunately, with all of the story beats that I have, I'm not sure how I'm going to make it less than 200 chapters. So I think, it's listed on Diamond like 1 out of 4. And I brought that up to Eli. I was like, yo, this is going to be way more than 4 volumes. And he was just like, oh, that's just there as a placeholder. Don't worry about it. I was like, okay. But so I think it's his hope that like eventually as I have more and more volumes that we're just going to condense them into omnibuses, and then they will only be available as that in the future when there's more volumes. But for right now, we're just doing in like kind of shorter capacity volume format.
That's cool. They are like each chapter, Matt, and maybe Ro, maybe you don't know this, you probably do, is about 5 pages of comics. That's like I went through and started counting.
Oh my God.
Just I was like, all right, what are we doing here?
Okay, I'm very appreciative that you actually went through that much trouble to figure that out.
I was like, what is a chapter? How many pages do I have to do to post on Webtoon? And I was like, oh, about 5. Okay, cool. Like that got around my brain pretty easy. That's that's cool. So you want to do 200 chapters, 200 times 5 is...
I'm hoping that I can do 200. I was really terrible, I feel like, at not having a faster sense of storytelling, but my oldest was like, no, Mom, there's too many stories that are way too fast in ADHD. So like, you're fine. Just keep it the way that it is. So she grounds me a lot. She eats books and she reads books. Like she'll read like a 500-page book in 2 or 3 days. So she's very, she has maybe more extensive, I think, book references in her mind than I have in my entire lifetime. So I trust her on that. I'm very dyslexic, which is why I do comics in the first place. I remember I wanted to be a writer as a kid, and I had a 3rd grade teacher that laughed at my writing and said, I will never be a writer. And so then at that time I realized, well, then fuck you, I'll draw my stories. And so, and then
So was that the point where you're like, hey, I'm gonna go into comics, or where was the first moment where you're like, hey, I really like
comics? Has always been a thing with me since I was little. So I had a very, very like almost National Geographic origin, like upbringing, like when you see like very provincial, very like impoverished places, like where it's very tribal, like that's where a lot of my mom's side of the family came from. I was just joking over the Super Bowl where they were just kind of like, well, how provincial are we talking? And I'm like I'd be running around as a toddler without like pants on, and we'd be playing tag, and then if we wanted to like poop in the middle of tag, we just poop there. So it was pretty, we were roughing it, and as a kid, you don't really realize that sort of thing. But oh gosh, where was I going with this? Right. So I was a very delayed speaker. So I remember distinctly being like 2 or 3, and I couldn't talk very much. And to the point where my brothers took full advantage of that, where one of them was just like, oh, he took my fingers and he made me do this, and hold up my middle finger, and he's like, okay, go to Mom and show her, and she'll be so proud of you, right? And so I remember waddling over to my mom and being like, right? And my mom just like getting super angry at me, and then me not really understanding why. And then I remember watching like the Sesame Street. I said this to Chris Anderson as well. Like I remember watching the Sesame Street segment where these kids had dropped a silver dollar down the sewer, and then they just kind of like silently came up with this plan, or there was a montage of them like, I'm going to chew gum, I'm going to stick it to the string, we're going to stick the string to the stick, and then we're going to get the silver dollar out that way. And they got it out, and that was the end of the segment. But I just thought it was like the bee's knees and the best thing. So I remember trying to draw stick figures of sequence of like how it all happens, because I didn't have the verbiage to say any of that. And I remember like bringing it to every adult that I can see, and I'm pretty sure they couldn't understand like what I was trying to do, and they would just pat me on the head and let me walk away. But I was very, very satisfied with that response. It was the first time that I felt like, oh, I could communicate without having to say these things, say words. So I think comics has been with me since I learned how to communicate, really. I see it as I'm a very like huge linguistic nerd, and so I kind of see it as its own, the closest thing that we can get to universal grammar at this point. Like even if you don't read the language that the comic is in, being able to understand to a point just through like the storytelling and the gestures of the characters, I think that's amazing. Like being able to do that without speaking the same language, which is why I just love comics in general. I don't think I don't think I could ever like stop comics, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned that you went to the manga school.
Yeah.
And can you talk about that? You only went for a semester, but you said it was intense, and I want to hear all about that.
So I used to draw like these comics in elementary school and in junior high, and I remember my classmates being like, "What's the next chapter?" And I'd be like, "Here it is." And it'd be like in a binder with like page protectors and everything. And then people would, and this is before I realized that in a lot of American comics, you would have guest pinup work. So a lot of people would be like, "Can I make a guest pinup?" And then we'd put it in between chapters and everything. So it was pretty cool. I still have some of them like stashed away in here. Not any of my ones from elementary, but I still have some of the ones that I had from junior high and high school. And I actually got into the art department at Western Washington University by like working on a portfolio while I was in high school. And it was a really hard, I guess, department to get into, but I got in somehow. And my parents, very overbearing Asian parents, and they didn't understand like what you could do in art. And so at the time, my brother had just graduated in graphic design, and he was like job hunting for 6 months, which back then was just kind of super taboo. That was a no-no for them. They just had this idea that like, what we paid for college and you're supposed to get a job right away. And he ended up having like a really ritzy job, soon after. But at the time, he didn't have that yet. And so my parents pressured me to drop art and do something else. So that's where I became a linguistics major. And I really fell in love with that. And then through that, that's where I got a job in Japan. And I was like living there for a while. I was there with my husband at the time. He proposed to me before I moved to Japan. I think it was his way of making sure like, you better live where I live. And, I lived there for about 3 years. And right after we got married, he said, all you do is talk about art still. And you explain all these amazing things to me every time you watch animations or watch TV shows, like behind the scenes stuff. Like, why don't you just get back into it? And I'm like, I don't know. Like, I just felt like it was kind of a heartbreaking memory for me to be forced to give it up at the time when I was in uni. And he was like, look, we live walking distance from this manga school. Why don't we just go to the orientation? Why don't you just see how it is? And the tuition, including the art supplies cost, was only $3,000 for 6 months. It was just amazing. And so it was a 2-year course, and you were supposed to, what they basically do is crank out manga assistants for professional manga creators. And so only through so the pipeline to make like an actual manga creator is that like you get a certification for it, and it's like an AA equivalent to that. And so you would do that for 2 years, get the certification, and then you would like right away study under or be an inker for, or like a background artist or the letterer for a mangaka. And then while learning under that professional, then you come up with your own pitch that you then pitch to the mangaka's publisher. And usually the mangaka would like, encourage you and all of that. So that was like the pipeline that I was like ready to go through. And so I took night classes. Like they're usually supposed to be every day, but these night classes condensed like, I think it was like 4 or 5 hours in one class, 2 nights a week. So I would like bike there after work and then be there for a really long ass time and then go home really tired. But it was really intellectually stimulating for me. And then at that time we're kind of suckered into trying to start a I say that because most of our friends, we lived in Yakuza district, and the only people that we could be friends with in Yakuza district were the restaurant owners, who happened to be a lot older, and they kind of adopted us as they're like, oh, the cute, young couple that lives on our street. And they were just like really pressuring us to like, oh, it takes a long time to start having kids. Like if you start now, you can have a kid in a year. Nah, it took us like 2 months. And so I like, as soon as I got pregnant, something snapped in my husband's mind. And because he grew up very multicultural. And so he was like, I don't want to raise our multicultural kids in this country. We need to go back to the States. And so I was devastated because I had expected that we were going to live there for the rest of our lives. It ended up being a great decision to move back here because my children would, the way that they are and their personalities, they would not have shined the way that they are here in the States. So I think it was very, I am very appreciative of my husband now that he had the foresight to see that. But at the time, I had romanticized living there for so long, and I just loved living there despite the problems that it had there, just because it was like, all those things that you hear about Americans being like, I'm going to live abroad, it's going to be so much better. Like it was exactly that for me at the time. But of course, like, when you're having a family, like there was more to think about. And that's why I only had the semester. And, I went back, but I had a lot of good memories there. Our teacher was very, very strict. And there were a lot of times too, where he would just kind of say like, oh, only one person got 100% on this. And he would make eye contact with me really quickly. And he's like, but we're not going to talk about who that is. We're just going to say that like, I usually don't give out 100%. And so I was like, oh, right. So he did that a lot, just kind of subtly.
So did you get the 100? You were the person that got the 100%?
Yeah, on that particular assignment. Yeah. It was like something about toning, like learning. And because I had, a lot of these people didn't have any previous experience with doing comic or art in general. And so I think he realized like, oh, wait, she has a knack for this and she's probably done this before. And then at the same time, I wasn't Japanese. And so I think was impressed with that. He said he never had like a foreigner in his class. So usually when you have a foreigner in manga school, it's people that are from Korea or China, and they go there, they get the certification, they go back to their own country, and then they work on comics and animation there. So I was one of the only ones that like he expected like, wait, no, you're going to be a foreigner, but you're going to stay in Japan and you're going to make stuff for Japan. So I think he was excited for that. So when that didn't happen, he said like, hey, don't be a stranger. Just come visit if you ever come back. I never did, but I was very appreciative that he was like that. And so I tried to continue that again, thinking that I would return back and kind of go to his class again. And so that's why I had started a lot of stuff like in manga format, like Japanese manga format instead of American way.
my brain has just exploded because I really want to see like the Netflix movie where like the foreigner goes to the manga class in Japan.
I mean, it's
like,
true now.
The other, like it has.
No, it's already happening. It's real life now. There's so many. There's a lot that are like key animators for a lot of the popular anime shows that's coming up now. Like if you just go on YouTube, there's so many. There's so many to the point that like I don't think 10 years ago I would have fathomed that it is the way that it is now. But because Japan is the way it is, it's very private. There's a lot of things that they can't talk about. Like, so even if they write a comic as a foreigner, like there's still censorship is still a huge problem over there. So One Piece, of the manga One Piece, he writes about a lot of political commentary about stuff that you're not supposed to talk about in Japan, but he disguises it as like other things. So he's very fuck the police, but in a legal way. And I appreciate that about him, but that's the only way that you could ever do those things. So right now, like Japan's foreigner problem is very much like self-made. So they invite a lot of foreigners that live in their country right now. As I was leaving Japan, they were falsely accusing a lot of like Brazilians as the, people who broke all of the, like kind of what we're going through now, but they actually successfully deported like all of the Brazilians, even the second or third generation who had never lived in Brazil before, don't even speak like Portuguese and stuff. And so I only know about that because my husband was interpreting for a lot of them who worked at the Toyota factories. And he was like kind of interpreting for the Japanese lawyers, kind of explaining to them, like, you need to sign these papers that mean your next 2 generations are never allowed to come back to Japan. All because they just decided in 2008, like, nope, they're all criminals, they need to go.
Oh my God.
So then when they all left, they realized, holy crap, we don't have enough Japanese population to do this work. So then they invited Vietnamese people to replace them. And so that's what you see now. You see a lot of people there that were invited specifically by the Japanese government under these programs where they have like 5 to 10-year work visas. And so now Japan's going through this thing of like, we're being replaced by Vietnamese people. So it's
crazy.
It's interesting.
Yeah, no, that's so. So, have you ever sent your teacher your book?
Oh goodness, right? I haven't, because I get so worried that it doesn't look good. But the dirty little secret that I found out about Japanese artists, Japanese comic creators, is they think that we think that way as Americans. They think that, you know, they can draw whatever, a Japanese audience are very happy with it. But as soon as it comes to America, like, you know, because Americans are not shy about complaining, like that's where they're scared of that. But then I had the opposite where, like, as an American, I felt like, oh, my art's not good enough for what they do. So I think we both just have, like, both sides just have, like, you know, unreasonable pressure.
Do you want me to you want to give me his contact and I'll email him for you? I'll be the intermediary.
If he's still a teacher, I wouldn't be surprised if he's like no longer teaching there and just kind of, you know, rolling in the dough with his. He used to draw a lot of like. Are you familiar with like those kind of 1950 style rock and rollers, like Japanese people like that just kind of dance in the park and stuff? That's how he looked like. And a lot of his comics were based off of like that genre. And so I know that genre will never ever die, and his art was phenomenal. So I mean, maybe he's rolling in the dough making his own art right now and no longer a teacher. But yeah, I mean, if he was still a teacher, we'll see. I'll think about that. I've never thought about that though. I've been too much of a chicken.
All right, 2 things. What's your dog's name?
My dog's name is Mocha.
Oh, Mocha.
Because he was brown when we first got him. He's more like a latte now. And I was almost going to name him after a character in this webcomic called Solo Leveling. It's now like an animation, but it started out as a web novel and then and now it's a webcomic and it's completed. And there's this one kind of pet-ish character on there that I wanted to name him after. And that character's name was Beru, but it's not Beru, right? And so we were worried if we left him with a sitter that they'd like call his name. And if they don't pronounce it right, he's not going to respond and like run away. And then we lost the dog. So we went with an easier Mocha, like, you know, that's easier to pronounce in any language. So, yeah.
One of my favorite comic strips is For Better, For Worse. Mm-hmm. Because it actually, like, everybody grew up and everybody aged in the comic.
I loved that one. I grew up reading that one. Yeah.
So when you mentioned your comic strip about your family, like, all I want to do is read that now.
Oh, yeah. I get a lot of comments saying that I should compile all of this. And I've only made like maybe 20 of them, you know, in totality in the past like 10 years. But I think I would have to probably sit down and have a conversation with the family. Everyone is very, very private. As much as, you know, I do put them on my Facebook and on my Instagram a lot. That's different from them actually knowing like things that happen in our life and everything. But both of my kids are very neurodivergent. My oldest is on the autism spectrum. My youngest is really ADHD. And then my husband's probably autistic as well, just kind of undiagnosed. And then I am dyslexic. So we all have our own things going on. And I think there might be, the only reason why I haven't done that is because if I ever made something that was portrayed in a way that was insensitive, like I don't think as a parent I'd forgive myself. And also we hear a lot about like those family vloggers that just kind of make money off of their kids. And I think as an overcorrection, I was like avoiding that, you know? to try to like use them as content. But still, I just love gushing about them so much that that's why the 20 comics came out here and there.
Yeah, no, I just saw I don't know if it was New York Times or one where like they interviewed this little kid who reviews Shirley Temples, and he's reviewed over 200 Shirley Temples, and I was like, that kid's not reviewing Shirley Temples. That parent is just shoving the camera in his face and being like, "What do you think about your drink?" And be like, I'm like, there's only like 3 ways to make a Shirley Temple, like perfect, too much syrup, not enough syrup. That's your review right there. Like, it's great. We're done with this. Yeah. I'm really upset because like I was a Shirley Temple connoisseur as a kid, so I saw this.
Oh.
What is this kid doing?
What's this kid doing? You missed your chance, Matt. That's it's interesting. I have working with a lot of students that go to SCAD, and they all have separate. They have like, this is my art account, this is my personal account, kind of thing. And I have been kind of encouraging people to be like, no, make it one account, because people don't care. Like I don't think people care about my art as much as they just like seeing me drink with friends. That is what seems to be attracting an audience, and has nothing to do with me drawing a fully drawn thing.
Well, nowadays people want to know the creator, right? Like, it's not about the art.
So. Yeah, having some kind of connection, and you coming from YouTube, having that connection with an audience, and then moving into comics, and then creating a barrier, creating the separation.
Yeah.
In people now finding you as you're the past and the present combined. I'm gonna blow it up for a second. The past and the present combined in a magical way that do some crazy magic.
You sound creepy.
No, but it's like a combination of worlds. Do you think that moving forward, because you have this kind of past coming back to light and the present being your art not being hidden by a style or anything, that you were able to be authentically yourself in the things that you're doing further? It took me a while to get there, but I got there.
So I think like Shelley Bond had said something in an interview with Eli, I think last month or the month before, and she said something along the lines how like the act of reading a comic is very intimate. It's like an intimate relationship with the creator, because you do like, it's page by page, and if like, let's say the comic is, she didn't say this part, but I was thinking about like, well, what if the comic is like your minds, your body, like on all of that, and someone is sitting there and like just kind of preciously looking at it and analyzing, and that's kind of a scarier thing, because when I was on YouTube, it was literally just for shits and giggles. Like, what can I do to make the audience laugh? Like, what can I say that's really stupid looking? What kind of jokes can I put in here? And it was definitely a character that I played. And again, I didn't use my real name or anything. And I looked a lot different than I do now. I definitely looked like a child back then. And even when I had children, I looked like a child that had a child. So it's I think right now it's a little hard for me to, I think about the safety of that facade back then, and then now not really having that safety anymore with how intimate comics are.
There is a certain, Matt knows, gonna get on me for this, but there is a certain kind of magic when you draw something and it works for the first time, or it doesn't. It's like the characters just kind of happen, and it is what it is. Like, it's just blanketly, oh yeah, this is who you are, this is where it is. And
like you kind of feel like the universe is doing work through you.
Yeah. You're not in control at that point, right? There's some greater force figuring it out. And you know, I feel that way all the time when I write something, or I just write the problem and the characters figure out the problem. I'm doing it, but it's at the same point, it's just like, oh yeah, it's just happening. And that's like, I think the most true version of the thing that you are creating.
Yeah. So I am Penny is my favorite like character I've ever created. Just and I feel so excited to get to know her as the story goes on. It's easier for me to create if I feel like that something else is like, actually telling me to create it. I think there's more pressure if I feel like that I did it. And it often feels a lot like Tetris, where it's just like, oh wait, this fits, and let's just keep going. So,
Ro, this has been a lovely interview. We end every interview asking the guests the exact same questions every single time. So, are you ready? Rapid fire.
Sure.
General questions at the very end of the podcast. Question number 1. What are you bringing to IC3?
Volume 2 of Half of the Crown, and also some mini comics of the comics that I told you about from my family and experience abroad.
Oh, exciting. What is the strange art tool that you grab for all the time?
Recently, I just got it. The tour box.
What is this?
Yeah, I'm like, what is that? I don't know what that is.
It looks like a controller.
A total miss for us.
It's for my left hand. It like zooms in. There's each button does different things, and I'm just like, they're all hotkeys, and I'll just do stuff on here while I'm drawing instead of using hotkeys on the keyboard. It's a lot easier.
Okay, so
my hand doesn't have to move; it just stays in one place.
So you're right-handed, and you're like drawing, and then with the left
I'll
hand,
just use this, and this
you're
is
like
zoom in, and then this kind of rotates the thing, and yeah,
it's some real Star Trek shit.
Yeah.
I just got it, and I was kind of screwing around with it recently, but I think it's I needed it because the hotkeys are on my Cintiq, and my Cintiq is upright, and so I ended up doing like crab hands all the time, pressing the hotkeys, and that wasn't good for my wrist. So
interesting. Are you a schedule or a feeling creator?
Both. I feel like I have to gaslight myself into doing it. I think the panic of deadlines and the pressure is a very good motivation. So.
Yeah. What is your proudest moment as a comic book creator?
Oh, proudest moment as a comic book creator. Seeing my youngest kid bring the comic to school and brag about it. I think I never imagined anything or expected that. So she's very much my biggest fan, and I didn't envision that. So
that's amazing. Yeah. Who is your biggest influence?
Oh gosh. So this guy draws mostly smut now, but he didn't used to when I was a kid. He's relatively unknown in the world of non-smut, but his name is Kentaro Yabuki. And because I used to buy his comics a lot, like as a 10-year-old kid. Akira Toriyama, I was huge influence from his comics when I was like making comics as a kid. And most recently, like Jorge Jimenez, like I can't get over his art. I think it's divine. So
yes,
it's a good list.
Who is your favorite Disney princess?
I don't know. It's not a princess, but my favorite Disney character is the general that sings "Be a Man" in Mulan.
Oh yes,
he's my favorite.
He's a Disney princess.
Yeah.
Why can't I?
Wait! Does this count? Gargoyles.
Gargoyles.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, was there a princess in Gargoyles?
There was a girl in Gargoyles.
There was a girl. There was multiple. There was a detective, and I think there's a female.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. She had the Jennifer Lopez jeans. Yeah.
And the final question to end the night: what stories interest you?
Ooh. The stories that interest me are the ones where when it ends and it wraps up, I realize like I'm rewarded for paying attention because they have details from the beginning that they incorporate. It's I think those are very clever, and it makes me feel like even as a viewer or audience or reader, like I had progressed. I had done something productive.
This has been awesome. Thank you so much, Ro.
Thank you so much, though, guys. I know
Well,
it's really late for you,
Thank
and
you.
I appreciate all that, and I appreciate all the work that you're doing. I know it's not easy, and you did so much last year. I don't know how you stayed alive, but yeah, I appreciate it, and I'm sure everybody else does too.